So I'm giving this presentation because, you know, most of the time when we talk about anti-racism, we talk about it from phenomenological perspective. We look at data, we look at social scientific data, we look at psychology, you know, we look at all sorts of ways to talk about anti-racism. But something we don't do in the church is, and I very rarely seen this, is we don't talk about anti-racism as being part of our creedal position. And so my hope for you today, and some of you here have actually been in my systematic theology class, so some of this might actually be familiar to you. But my hope is that you not just understand anti-racism from our creed, but that you actually understand what we are claiming when we say the creed and how anti-racism fits in with that. So this is a bit of a lesson on the Trinity, what we claim as Christians about the Trinity, which can be a very confusing concept. And then from there to make a connection between our creedal confession, our Nicene Confession, and our work toward anti-racism. So, Elizabeth, if you could just pull up that slideshow, and I will call when to flip the slide.
Thanks very much. Oh, and I need to go back because that.
Well, it was just working.
Yeah, there we go. It says my screen share is paused. I'm not sure why. There we go. That should be all right. Can you guys see?
I'm getting a black screen.
Okay.
I am as well.
I will stop sharing and then share again.
Okay, that is strange. It was just working.
I don't know why it's black screening. You know what? I think the devil is in the thing here today. Okay, your screen sharing is paused. Stop share and let me share again. Okay.
There we go. Nice. Okay, very good. So I just gave you a little intro into what we're talking about today, and so we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, okay.
So the
Again, it went black. I don't know why. Sorry.
oh, I'm still seeing the first screen.
And I'm not. That's so weird. I think I've got it. You know what? There's two power two what do you call
You
it?
might,
Two bars showing.
yeah, maybe close
So I'm
one.
closing them both and I'm
Yeah.
gonna open it again. There. You should be able to see, right?
Yeah, now I can see. And can
Okay,
we go,
perfect.
and do you have the next slide?
Yes, just a sec. There you go. Sorry.
Lovely.
There we
Okay,
go.
it's working now. Very good. So the learning objective today, so we've got some contents in here. So we'll talk about the learning objective and the learning path, the way we're going to go. We're going to talk about a bit about scripture on race. We're going to define some terms about racism and what race and racism are. And then we're going to talk about theology as addressing racism. And then we'll have a Q&A, and there's some resources at the end. So next slide, please. So the objective of our learning today is to take a posture of anti-racism as being part and parcel of our creedal position. So I want us to rethink our primary sense of identity and become a church that conscientiously resists acts of exclusion based on racial difference and takes the posture of anti-racism as coming out of our confession. So anti-racism isn't something that is taken from outside, from psychology, but that it's actually taken from within our own Christian confession. And so the way that I'm going to go there is I want to take a path of rooting our conversation in scripture, talking about some categories and definitions, and then talking about our creed and theology. So I like this quote here. Who I am matters, but who I want to be matters more. So if you could flip to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about scripture on race and 1 Peter 2:9 and race as a social construct. So can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. I don't know if anybody feels like it. Could anybody just read out to the group? If you just want to unmute yourself, or if you can unmute yourself, just read out to the group 1 Peter 2:9. Can somebody read that, please?
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Please, thanks.
But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the excellence of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.
Okay, thank you. So next slide, please. So what I want to get at here, is that the Bible is actually ahead of the curve when it comes to talking about race. And now today we talk about anti-racism, but the Bible is actually ahead of the curve. And the reason I say that is because it already claims and understands that race is a social construct, and that race is not an inherent thing. It has no biological reality. We are one human race, and that race is really the ideas that we attach to skin color. It has no basis in reality. Notice what it says. But you are a chosen race. Who is the you? Anybody? Who is the you? Is it Black people? Who are the you?
Everybody.
Everybody. Everybody. Christians. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. So, for Christians, the Bible is already giving us a way to think about race, that we understand that race is not biological, but that we are one holy people. In this verse, it uses the word race, in Christ. So for Christians, there is no racial barrier to being one in Christ. We are one holy people together. But we know that race has had a huge impact on our identity and our lives because of how this construct, how this, what I would call made up construct, functions in our world. And we can see this in all sorts of ways. And, if the Bible being ahead of the curve is right, and race is merely a construct, a social construct, the question then becomes is, how does it become an effective construct in our society? How does it become an effective construct in our churches? When scripture, our main text, does not even recognize the category of race as being the color of our skin, but that our race is that we are Christian people, that we are a chosen race, a holy people, God's own people. So if you can flip to the next slide, Elizabeth, please. So we're going to talk about a little bit about defining racism. So there are two important concepts that we're going to talk about here: racial economics and systemic racism. So if you can flip to the next slide. So the question we're asking is, why does race function in the way that it does today? Now, normally when I give this presentation, this is usually like a whole morning session. So I'm actually gonna truncate. I'm gonna truncate a large part of this talk in this section. The thing that I really want you to think about, though, is this. Before the 16th and 17th century, so this is pre-Enlightenment, people classified themselves by their tribe, their clan, their religion, the kingdom in which they lived, the locale, their nationality, their wealth, their cultural habits, but they did not identify themselves by race as we understand it today. And this is not to say that people didn't acknowledge skin color. We're not blind. Not everybody is blind. We can see that people have other types of skin color. But we did not identify, human beings did not identify, I have to turn this light off. It's giving me a headache. I can't believe that. It's so strange. Sorry. Am I too dark for everybody now? I'm sitting in a very dark room. Is it okay? Okay. I didn't expect that to happen. Anyway, so before the 16th and 17th century, people did not identify themselves based on their skin color in the way that we understand it today. So race was not really even a category until the 17th century. I want you to really think about that. So it is a new concept, really, relatively speaking, in the history of the whole world. Race is actually quite a new concept. So what happens in the 17th century and onward is that race emerges as a new social classification and category that functions structurally toward an economic end. And so the thing that I want to get you to think about is that race emerges and it ties itself to economics. So what you see in the 17th century and onward is the rise of colonization in the Americas, and globally you start seeing this movement outward from European nations to other nations. And then you also have the new phenomenon. It's not, and I want to make this clear, it is not that slavery did not exist. It is not that slavery did not exist prior to the 17th century, but that race ties itself in a new way with the emergence of chattel slavery in the African continent, moving outward toward moving over toward the Americas. This was a completely new way of thinking about economics, and it was so tied to the emergence of this new concept called race. And over time, these two global historical events and systems became entrenched essentially in the world, especially in the mind, especially in the mind of the North Atlantic nations. And the North Atlantic nations would essentially be Western Europe and the Americas. And of course, Australia and New Zealand are part of that way of thinking as well. Could you please go to the next slide? I want to, oh, which is the next slide? Can you go back one slide, please? Thank you. And this, and yeah, so one before, yeah, thank you. We're on the right one now. I want to give you a quote here. So in the context of this emergence of race tied to economics in the 17th century, you have essentially a sense in which European people start to understand they start talking about race science and the emergence of eugenics and all these things and this dominance of white racial superiority. And Benjamin Disraeli, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in the late 19th century, I believe he was the Prime Minister of England from 1870 to 1880. Somewhere in there for about 10 years. He was a Jewish person who rose to a very high level of power in the UK, but he too had taken on this belief that emerged in the 17th century that propagated itself through colonization and chattel slavery, and it was a belief in white racial superiority. And I get a lot of pushback when I talk about this, but this is how people talk. This is their quotes. I'm just quoting them. Churchill said very similar things too, by the way. But I'm using this quote because it's so direct. Race implies difference. Difference implies superiority. And superiority leads to predominance. This is a direct quote from Disraeli. And that predominance is, and this difference and this superiority comes to be understood as completely inherent, biological, embedded in the genetics of white people. And so talking about things in this way, today we sort of bristle like, that's not a very good way to talk. But let's be honest, this is how they did talk. And this way of thinking moves into the 20th century, and it's still happening today, right now. We see it right now happening in the world, particularly in the way Palestinians are being dehumanized. So this way of thinking about race, implying difference, superiority, and predominance, gets wedded deeply, deeply, deeply into Western societies. Can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, one back, please. Oh, and one forward. Thank you. So this presumed racial superiority has not gone away. It is at the root of all Western societies. It is so embedded in our entire framework of how our societies have been constructed. It is embedded in multiple societal systems, education, law, government, sports, leisure, religious observance. And the actual definition of this is structural or systemic racism. That's the actual name for it. So when we're talking about racism, most people, they think about racism being burning a cross on someone's lawn, like the KKK, saying the N-word, right? That's what we think racism is. Oh, that's so racist. Trump calling Mexicans all rapists. And it is. I'm not saying that's not racism. But what that really is a reflection of the systems and structures beneath the scene that allow somebody to say those things, somebody to make those discriminatory acts. It is systems and structures. So if you think about a dock, if you think about a dock being made, just imagine it in your head. The dock goes out over the water, and what happens on top of the dock, that's those specific incidents of discrimination, prejudice, racism. But what's holding up the dock, the thing that's holding up the dock, that is actually what racism is. That is systemic, it is structural, it is embedded, it is deep into the laws and government of our society. And I can see that Father Stevens just said something here. We can go back to some questions later. Right. Yes. So hopefully we'll have time to go back through the chat because some good things are being said in the chat here. So what I want you to get is that when we talk about racism, and now I never say her name quite right, but I just want to try it here. Kihulani Kawanwi. She actually is a Hawaiian, an indigenous Hawaiian person, an academic, and she has coined this phrase, and I want you to hear this. She says that racism is a structure and not an event. Racism is a structure and not an event. So she wants us to get away from thinking about racism as simply those acts, those individual acts that are disrupt, are unseemly and insulting to other people of other racial groups. She wants us to recognize that racism is a structure. It is embedded in law, government, sports, leisure, television, religious observance, on and on and on. It is not merely events. Not merely events. So if we could go to the next slide. So I'm just gonna ask a question. So if I can just see some nods, is this making sense so far? Are you feeling like you're hearing what's going on here? So yeah, I see some nods. I see the question here that in the chat. I'm looking at the wrong thing here. I see the question in the chat. What is chattel slavery? Chattel slavery, just so that we're clear, chattel slavery emerges when the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, emerges in the 17th century. And we know that mainly Africans from Western Africa were enslaved and brought to the Americas. When they got to the Americas, they were essentially chattel, like cows are chattel. Their entire humanity was dehumanized to the point where they were seen as no different as buying and selling livestock. And what's more than that, these people were owned. These human beings were owned, and the right to ownership was completely based on skin color. White people were allowed by law to own Black African people and to keep them in servitude in perpetuity forever. So this condition of chattel slavery was inherited and passed down to children. So it went on and on and on and on until emancipation. And I mean, still things were not the way they should be. Then Jim Crow, civil rights, and even today we still see the effects of chattel slavery in our society. Did that help define? Did that help define? I hope so. Okay, so I want to keep on going. I don't want to. I just noticed that was an important point. Some people might not have known what that was. So here we are talking about racism being a structure and not an event. Now, in our next slide, where am I here? I want to read to you what the dictionary definition of racism is. So the dictionary definition of racism is this: prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people based on their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. So this is just from the Webster's dictionary. My question to you very quickly is, what's wrong with this definition? Based on what I've said right now, just now, what's wrong with this definition? Which, most people won't think about an academic definition of what racism is. They'll go to the dictionary. So what is problematic about this definition? Does anybody have an idea? You can just unmute yourself, hopefully, or...
This talks about events rather than that system that you were talking about.
That's right. That's one really, really excellent point. It's talking about events and not actually about the structure, the laws, the whole societal thing that allows discrimination, prejudice, antagonism to happen toward individuals. What's the other thing that it's not hinting at here? This one might be a little harder to actually tease out. Can anybody see it?
Dr. Allison, I think it's just missing the whole element of colonization, which created the structures and the systems underneath anything that would allow this behavior.
I think you're getting to the exact point, which is that it equalizes the playing field, right? So there's no acknowledgement of colonization, of chattel slavery, of the embeddedness of these structures. And think about conversations you might have had with people in passing, or serious conversations about race with people, and how you'll often I will see this a lot on social media, especially where a white person will accuse a person of color of being racist. And what I'm trying to get at here is that this dictionary definition, which is what most people will use because they're not educated around these questions, it levels the playing field so that it is possible to believe that in North American society that white people can experience racism too. And I want to make this very, very clear. This is a fallacy. Reverse racism doesn't exist. It is not possible in Western society, perhaps even in the world, perhaps. And it is not possible when one racial group has set up all of the multi-level social systems that favors that one group to have benefit, right? So if you have friends who say to you, you're being, well, that Black person is being racist toward me, it is pretty much impossible when you think about the academic technical definition of racism in North America for that to happen. Reverse racism, I just want to make this clear, reverse racism does not exist. Andrea, I can see your hand is up. Do you want to make a point?
Yeah, just also about the definition, that it makes it sound as if it's just a matter of insults or hurt feelings and not about structural, social, and economic disadvantages that are part of that whole system. And that ties in with your comment about reverse racism.
Right, exactly. So the focus that I want to get at is that we are talking about structures. When we talk about racism, we are talking about structures and not simply events. And again, I just want to be clear that in the advent of colonization and chattel slavery, race emerges in a very new way. And so all the bad things that happened prior to the 17th century, it's not that they weren't bad, but they weren't racist in the same way that we understand it today. Race was not applied in the same way pre-17th century as post 17th century. So I hope that is clear to people as we continue on to the next slide. Oh, can we go back one? Can we go back one slide, please? Thank you. Oh. Oh, I can't hear you, Elizabeth. Sorry. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. So just one more forward. Thank you. One more forward. Oh, it's skipping that slide. Okay. Oh, there we, no, one more ahead. There we go. Thank you. So in a very good book called Microaggressions in Ministry, I would really encourage people to read it if you're doing any kind of ministry. Because it actually doesn't just deal with racism. It talks about all sorts of microaggressions against women, against LGBTQ. It's a little book, not big. You can read it quite easily, but it's a helpful little book. It says in that book, racism is a system of advantage for white people in a society structured by a legacy of racial injustice that privileges white racial identity over all others. I mean, I think for most of you here today, I'm not saying things that you've not observed. Can I see? I'm just gonna take a look at you here. For how many of you am I talking out of left field here? I've lost you here. What's going on? Oh no. So am I talking out of left field here? Or for some of you, yeah, like I see people nodding. So again, racism is a system of advantage for white people in a society structured by a legacy of racial injustice that privileges white racial identity over all others. It's from Microaggressions in Ministry. Now my PowerPoint has frozen, which is not great. What is going on here? Okay. All right. Oh, my PowerPoint has frozen. This is not great. So I think I think another point that I'm going to have to close my PowerPoint. Shoot, why is this happening? No, stop. Let me just close my PowerPoint.
I think it's just been a day of stuff.
Yeah, it's really weird. That shouldn't be happening.
It's funny because when I click, if I click a little too hard, I get two toolbars, and that's what's been messing me up. So I apologize for that.
Let me just, man, my computer is not happy with me right now. Let me just try to pull it back up again. I'm just going to move you over here. Okay, we are on, it seems to be working. So the thing that I wanted to get at is that no one, and I mean no one, is unaffected. Is that the slide we're on, Elizabeth?
We're on unaffected by powerful systems. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So my point here is that no one is unaffected by these powerful systems. And I'll tell you a quick story. Just want to watch my time here. Oh, it turns out I have lots of content. Good for the time that we have. Oprah, the richest woman in the world. You know, a lot of people think that wealth is the great equalizer. Oprah was in a store in France a number of years ago, and she tells the story, and I find this very interesting. And nobody would serve her. I mean, nobody would serve her in this store, in a posh store in Paris, because the assumption was that she didn't have the money and she was there to steal something. And so she was ushered out of the store. And she's thinking to herself, I'm Oprah. Do you not know who I am? Now, maybe that wouldn't have happened in the States. I don't know. But the store personnel didn't know who she was. Barack Obama, he will talk about the fact that he still can't hail a cab in New York City. Right? So no one is unaffected by these events. Not if you're rich, not if you're well known, not if you're powerful. That's how deep and embedded it is. And even nice Christians, unless they are very conscious of this, unless they are very conscious of structural racism in our society, is able to combat these forces. And this is why racism exists in our churches. Structural racism exists in our churches because even if we are nice people, we are not unaffected by these systems. So if we can go to the next slide. What I want you to do, because it is, this can be very triggering. This conversation can be very triggering. Not always is, but it can be very triggering, is just to sit for 1 minute, and I'm going to time it, for 1 minute with what you've just heard. And then we're going to get to the theological, theological meat. Okay, so you can close your eyes, but take 1 minute and just sit quietly. Okay, so can we go to the next slide, please? So this is where we're going to get to what we're going to try to put this all together. Okay. So we're going to talk about theology addressing racism. So not sociology, not data points, not phenomenological approach, but we're talking about our creed, our confession addressing racism. And I want to do this because because if these systems are so strong that they have outweighed the scriptural imperative for us to be one holy people. And if you ask any racialized person in our churches, we love our church. We love God. We want to follow Jesus, but we know that we have experienced racism in our church. And so, and I think a lot of white folks know that there is structural racism in our church and they don't want it to be there. So how do we address racism in our churches, structural racism in our churches, and be actively anti-racist? And again, I'm not trying to denigrate other approaches. They're actually really important. But let's try and talk about this from a Christian confession. Next slide. So how many of you have heard the word metanoia? Does anybody know what that word means? I guess I put it on the slide. I put it on the slide. So metanoia is a Greek word, and what it means is to change one's mind. And I love this word because it's actually the heart of conversion. It's kind of like you're going down one road and you actually turn the other way. And so when you follow Jesus and you leave the broad path and to go the narrow path, that is metanoia. To go the hard and difficult path, that is metanoia. And so I like this word. I like this word of metanoia because what my hope is for those who struggle with these questions is for us to have a metanoia in our church, a conscientious rejection of any assumed belief that the quintessential essence of the human being is identified by that natural, inherent predominance that Disraeli and Churchill and others have talked about, of European cultural normativity and white complexion, and the complexion of white skin. And what I want to say is that part of this metanoia is that as Christians, we reject this racial belief that is embedded in Western society and really the whole world. But really, we live in Western society, but it is embedded in Western society, and that we reject this racial belief and find a new primary identity, the one that First Peter talks about. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own chosen people. And and that we root our identity in scripture and our creedal confession and the things that we confess. And so the way I want to go about this is, if we could go to the next slide, is to talk about the Nicene Creed. Now, how many of you here, if you could just put up a show of hands, how many of you say the Creed pretty much every week at church? Some of you do. Yeah, some of you do. You say the Creed at church. And, you know, some of you here might have done a degree in theology. Some of you might not have. So let's go over very quickly what our creed is really about. So the Council of Nicaea, we're talking about the Nicene Creed here. The Council of Nicaea, which took place in 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea met to debate the nature of the relationship between two of the three persons of the Trinity, God the Father and God the Son. And just a quick lesson here, philosophical lesson. When we talk about the Trinity, and when the fathers, the church fathers, talked about the Trinity, church fathers and mothers, they were distinguishing between two concepts, the concept of substance and the concept of person. And the concept of substance is essentially essence. It is the essence of what something is. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. There are all sorts of chairs, right? There are rocking chairs, and there are lawn chairs, and there are recliners, and there are tables that you put at the dining table chairs, and there's all sorts of different chairs. But somehow all these different chairs share something in common, what you might call chairness. I know it sounds like a funny thing to say, but they share an essence of what it means to be a chair. And so that essence of what it means to be of chairness, that is substantive. Substance or essence is different from person. Person is all the different chairs. It's all the different chairs that are out there. So the creedal confession, what Nicaea came out as saying in the end, was that the Trinity, when we talk about God as triune, as Trinity, that there are three persons who share in one divine substance. Three persons who share in one divine substance. Another way of thinking about this, and we use this analogy in our class, my husband and I, when we teach theology, is that think about music or notes on a piano. You make a chord from three individual notes. They would be akin to person, the three individual notes. But when they're played together, they share in sound. They share in the essence of sound. Let's take ourselves, for instance. So there are so many of us, diverse people with who look different, and yet we are individual people, persons who share somehow in the same essence of humanity. So I hope that that makes sense about substance and person, and that this is what Nicaea was about. Two of the concepts that emerged out of Nicaea was homoousios, which means of the same substance, and homoiousios, which means of similar substance. And when Nicaea was meeting, there was something called the Arian controversy, and Arius was in his desire to protect the perfections of God, he claimed that the Son could not possibly be of the same substance as the Father. He could not be homoousios, because that would mean that somehow the Son who takes on human nature was bringing some kind of imperfection into the Godhead. And he was adamant that the Son was not equal to the Father, but subordinate to the Father. Well, after 3 months of debate, or months and months of debate, what Nicaea finally decided, and this is what we confess every week, is that the Father and the Son are of the same substance. They are not homoousios. So Arius was called a heretic in the end, but that the Father and the Son are homoousios. They are of the same substance. That is our creedal confession. That is our creedal confession. So can we go to the next slide, please? So just to reiterate, the Father and the Son share in the same divine substance, not a similar substance. And the Son is not subordinate in any way to the Father. The Son is homoousios with the Father. And to claim homoousios, in the end, was deemed a heresy by Nicaea. So homoousios, this claim of similar substance, is heresy. Homoousios is our tradition. The Father and the Son are of the same substance. Next slide, please. Now, I want to tell you a story. Willie Jennings, he is a theologian and a professor in the United States. And he tells this really interesting story about how he was on a hiring committee. He was on a hiring committee, and he's sitting there in the hiring committee, and this is for a biblical studies position at his seminary. And a young man comes in, and he's the only racialized person on the committee. A young white man comes in, and he's dressed the same as his colleagues. He's talking in the same way as his colleagues, and he is very much has the same lifestyle, the same commitments, the same politics. And he has this insight because they had just interviewed a Black woman for the same position, and she didn't get the job in the end. And he has this moment where he's reflecting on this, and he, as a Black man, and he realizes that what that young man who got the job had in common with the hiring committee was what he calls homoousios. He uses the word homoousios to describe this theological word, to describe what he's seeing happen in that hiring committee. He observes the sameness. He observes the kinship, the feeling of we are the same in that hiring committee, that this young woman, this Black woman who came in with the same credentials and the same publishing record, did not have. And he uses this deeply theological word to describe what is happening in that interview and how white folks see themselves as being of the same substance. And what he then says in his very important book, After Whiteness and Education and Belonging, is that this sameness, this feeling of homoousios, which is never named, but this feeling of sameness is part of the colonial power over superiority that you saw in that Disraeli quote that I mentioned earlier. So he sees that as being part of that colonial story. Next slide. So what I want you to do, because again, in the church, we think that we are lovely people, and we are. Most of us are really nice people. But again, these structures are so deep and they affect us so much that sometimes we don't even know we're doing this, right? So I want you to take 1 minute. I want you to take 1 minute and ask yourself a hard question. Close your eyes, turn off your screen if you need to. I want you to ask yourself, deep down in your heart, I'm not going to ask you to answer this, but I want you to think about for yourself, when you are encountering people in the world, in church, in the grocery store, on the subway, at a party, at an event, who do you think of as sharing in the same homoousios as yourself? Okay? Just take a minute. And 1 minute. You know, it's amazing to me how long a minute can seem when you're doing something uncomfortable. Whoops. Stop. Okay. So if we can go to the next slide. If we can go to the next, thank you. Thank you for the next slide there. What I want to get at here, and I want to say this. I myself had to do this work myself. I actually, I'm not coming here talking to you without having gone through this process myself. The fact of the matter is, because these systems affect everybody, even people who are racialized have to, the word is decolonize their own selves. And I had to ask myself the question, who do I see being of the same substance as myself? And I was so embedded as a human being, as a person, as an individual in North American society, in white racial superiority, that I had to admit that I didn't even see myself as being of the same substance. I was trying to be something that I wasn't. And this is what white supremacy does to everybody, including especially racialized people. Whiteness, which is another way of talking about white supremacy, through colonization and chattel slavery, racialized Christianity and civilization, wrongly, I would argue, came to be, and Jennings is arguing, came to be understood as being the same thing as humanness. So what it meant to be human through these systems was to be white. And I think when we are being deeply, 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 deeply honest with ourselves, we actually can admit this. But it is a very difficult thing to admit. It's a very difficult thing to admit. And this erroneous concept and use of homoousios, it helps us to understand where the impulse for racial superiority and coloniality came from, and it still comes from. It still comes from this place that those who are white share in the same substance of humanness, and those who are not white somehow don't. We are of similar substance, but not the same substance. This is what systemic racism does in our society. It categorizes some people as being of the same substance, those who have light complexion, white skin, and those who have darker skin as being of similar substance. We are seeing this play out in the world right now. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry. I'm getting taken in by your words here.
Oh, that's okay. Thanks. Next slide. Thank you. So what is our Christian response, right? So I am using our creedal confession, picking up on Jennings, on a wonderful Black theologian, Willie Jennings, wonderful systematic theologian, to talk about racism in our church and how we can respond to it. So what I want to get at is, on the level of substance, in our diversity, in the diversity of our persons, we are homoousios. So when we say, what is the Christian response to racism, we confess this: in the same way that the Father and the Son share in the same substance of divinity, we affirm as Christians that all human beings share in the same homoousios, the same substance of humanity. And to not truly live into this theological reality, to not make an effort to live into this theological reality, to not live fully into this theological reality of same substantiveness, is heresy. Racism is heresy. You can take just a pocket thought away today. Homoousios and racism is heresy. It is heresy. It is not part of God's life. Can I go to the next slide, please? One more big concept, theological concept, and that is the idea of perichoresis. Now, perichoresis is, from when we teach systematic theology in seminary, we talk about the immanent and the economic Trinity. The economic Trinity is how the three persons of the Godhead work outwardly toward the world. The immanent Trinity is how the three persons dwell and exist within one another, toward one another, apart from us, apart from creation. Perichoresis is the Greek word that talks about the mutual indwelling of the three persons of the Trinity, the mutual indwelling of the three persons of the Trinity, the reciprocal relationship that they have with one another. Mutually, it's almost like it's a circular relationship, but it spirals in and out of itself. Some might call this a kind of radical relationality. And the task of our conversion, of living into Scripture, of acknowledging that racism is heresy, is to consciously attempt and engage in forms of radical relationality that living into our shared humanity, into our shared homoousios, our shared substance, our shared substantiveness, regardless of the social construct of race. So we know that the social construct of race exists, but our metanoia calls us to something else. Our call is to be a chosen race, a holy people, a royal priesthood, God's own chosen people. And we recognize that homoousios is what it means to practice anti-racism. It's what it means to practice anti-racism and to understand it as coming out of our creedal tradition. There ends the lesson. There ends the lesson. The next slide is a Q&A. I'm going to pull you guys up here so I can see you. If you can go to the last two slides. Oh,
Oh,
you
sorry.
copy share? No, it's okay.
Ken. Resources?
Just a couple books. Willie Jennings, After Whiteness. I would say this is more of an academic book, but it's a really interesting book on race and theology. Microaggressions in Ministry, very practical book. Very practical book. I highly recommend it for those who are in ministry, who are doing lay ministry, ordained ministry. Really important book. Next slide, please. There's a couple more books there.
Oh.
We read this book as part of the anti-bias, anti-racism committee that the diocese put together. My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. This is a really amazing bridge building book. I would really encourage people to read this book if you can get a hold of it. Ibram Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist. He was the person who coined that phrase. It's not enough to, it is not enough to talk about race. I'm saying this wrong. It's not enough to just talk about racism. We have to be actively anti-racist. Like we have to intentionally be anti-racist. And that is Ibram Kendi in his book, How to Be Anti-Racist. And then a final book that I really would love people to get a hold of. It's short, not hard to read. And she, Emma DeBerry is a biracial Black woman from the UK. And she's half Irish, half Black. And she talks about what white people can do next, from allyship to coalition. So she is going beyond the idea of allyship, which is what we talk about these days, is how to be a good ally. She wants to get beyond allyship to where white folks are in lockstep with racialized people on this issue. And I would say that this is kind of where I'm coming from, because I want to talk about not just being a good ally, which still then privileges white cultural hegemony and white complexion, but that we actually look at how we build society together, because we are rejecting this idea that somehow we are homoousios, of similar substance. We are acknowledging that we are of the same substance of humanness, and that we will build coalitions together across multiple platforms and intersections.